You wanna read some books?
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name's Bennett Barclay. I write science fiction and fantasy, and on this channel I talk about all things science fiction, fantasy, or writing related. Today I want to do something that I've seen a lot of people do. I haven't been able to do it yet myself. Today I want to talk about my personal top 10 favorite fantasy series of all time. Now, this is not sci-fi. This is strictly fantasy. I was going to do a mix of science fiction and fantasy, but I discovered that the list would have to be twice as long if I wanted to include everything that belongs here. So I'm going to do a separate list for science fiction at some point down the road. But for right now, this is just my personal top 10 favorite fantasy. Now, this is purely down to my own personal taste. There may be stuff on here that you disagree with. There may be stuff that you think should be on the list that sadly is not. And if you have anything you think I should take a look at, or if you disagree with any of the choices I make, let me know down in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. So number 10 for me is The Legend of Drizzt by R.A. Salvatore. Now, I haven't really gone through and read any Drizzt books in quite a while. They were mostly influential on me when I was a teenager, but I have a lot of fond memories of them, and the Drizzt books, Drizzt as a character is a very compelling character, and I think Drizzt is one of the best pieces of the wider Dungeons and Dragons lore. One of the best things that came out of D&D, and honestly, in my opinion, probably should have been the main character of this new D&D movie. Drizzt is a character with a lot of interesting conflicts, and if you've never read any of Bob Salvatore's stuff, I highly recommend it. Check it out. At number 9 on the list, we've got The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. Now, this is the only graphic novel that I'm including on the list. I will do a whole separate video about graphic novels at some point because I'm a big comics fan. I'm a big graphic novel guy. But Sandman is the crossover, in my opinion, between graphic novels and literary fantasy. If you've never read The Sandman or you've never seen the Netflix show, The Sandman is the story of the King of Dreams, who gets trapped by these essentially hedge magicians and is imprisoned in our world for about 100 years. And the story of what happens to him and the aftermath and how this changes him as a person is told throughout these 10 volumes of graphic novels. I highly recommend it if you like slightly out there, trippy stories, if you like stories that deal with long-term continuity. This is definitely a series for you. Also, the art in this is truly spectacular. If you have any appreciation of popular art, definitely check this out. At number 8, we've got A Song of Ice and Fire, and I may be getting some shit from people for putting this one so low on the list. I love A Game of Thrones. I love A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole. I just have a hard time putting a series any higher up on the list when it's not finished and very likely will not be finished. You'll notice Kingkiller Chronicles, spoiler alert, not on my list. Not at all. George Martin at least gave us 5 books, and they're all really well written. They're beautiful books. The characters in these books are honestly my favorite part. Each character that he gives us is fully fleshed out and realized in ways that a lot of authors only aspire to. Martin is an incredible writer and an excellent historian. The world he builds here is nothing new to most Western fantasy readers. We're used to this medieval European setting, but it's so authentic in Martin's books. He's writing with such a sense of authority that it's much more immersive and grounded in history than the vast majority of medieval fantasy writers. Also, I do want to give a quick shout out to Bantam Books for this beautiful illustrated edition of A Game of Thrones. This is one of my favorite books that I personally own. Each chapter comes with a beautiful illustration, a color map. I absolutely adore this copy. Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire is absolutely worth checking out if you're one of the 4 people who haven't actually read it yet. Next, we've got Lightbringer by Brent Weeks. This is the series that made me love Brent Weeks. I read this series before Night Angel, and I know a lot of people love the Night Angel books. They're magic assassins. Like, what more do you want? But this is my personal favorite of Brent Weeks' work. It's got some flaws. It's got some warts. There's some legitimate criticisms that can be leveled at Lightbringer. There's some problematic stuff. There's some misogynistic stuff. But as a whole, the series is larger than that. It's beyond that. And this is one of the most enjoyable epic fantasies I've ever read. The first few books in particular, they're epic fantasies written with the pacing of a thriller. The magic system in Lightbringer is elegant and easy to grasp while having depth and complexity that unfolds as you get further into the story and that you can really dig into if you want to. But if you don't want to, that's fine. You'll still get a lot out of the story. It'll still work for you, and it'll still be a good time. So, Lightbringer, one of my all-time favorites. At number 6, it's the inevitable, the classic, The Lord of the Rings. I have to admit that I've only read through the trilogy a couple of times. I haven't gone back and reread it as often as I probably should have, as often as this series deserves. The movies were my entry point into The Lord of the Rings. I was a little kid when those movies came out, and for a long time, that's what Lord of the Rings was to me. I didn't read the book until I was in my late teens, and the book is a completely different experience. It is incredibly rich in a way that I haven't seen many modern fantasy writers copy. I think this is one of the things we've lost in modern fantasy is the richness of spirit that infused Tolkien's work. And to be fair, I don't think any of his immediate successors were able to fully copy it the way that they wanted. Tolkien stands on his own as the man who created a genre that we all know and love, that influenced me deeply, and I will forever love The Lord of the Rings and be grateful to him for creating this wonderful world in which we all wish we could live. And number 5 for me will be The Witcher. Now, like a lot of Americans, I got introduced to The Witcher through the exceptional video game and found out there were books, picked up the books, and I will say right now, if you're going into the books expecting the same experience that you got from the video game, just don't even bother. These are exceptional books, but they're very different experiences from the video game. Built around excellent characters, very well developed characters, very iconic characters. There is character development in these books, but it's not quite as dynamic as a lot of modern fantasy has its readers accustomed to being. I particularly love the first 2 books in this series, which is, they're both collections of short stories, and more often than not, they are sort of grittier, modern fairy tale retellings with the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia, as your primary viewpoint character going through these experiences. The Witcher has been incredibly influential on me. I'm writing a book about monster hunters, and that is in no small part because I fell in love with the Witcher concept and wanted to do my own spin on it. Andrzej Sapkowski is a remarkable writer, and we do need to give a special shout out to his translators. They really did a good job of capturing the spirit of what Sapkowski was trying to say. I've heard that in the original Polish, these books are almost poetic in how they're written, and that comes through in some spots more than others, but it does come through in the English translation. And so if you haven't read the Witcher books, don't expect it to be like the game, but go check it out because I do believe it's worth it. Now, guys, I'm ashamed to say that for my next entry, I don't actually have a physical copy. Don't hate me. Somehow, in the process of collecting, I never actually got around to getting physical copies of my next entry. So, here's my Kindle. I read most of these books on this. That counts, right? My next entry in my top 10, my number 4, is Stephen King's The Dark Tower. The Dark Tower was actually my entry into Stephen King, which is bass-ackwards to how a lot of people do it, and probably bass-ackwards to how it should be done, because if you're not aware, The Dark Tower is kind of the central pillar connecting the various narratives going on throughout King's multiversal stories. Not every work King does is tied into the Dark Tower, but an awful lot of them are. And if you're aware of that and you have read more King, you'll probably get more out of the Dark Tower than I did my first time reading it. But if you haven't read Stephen King, if you want a darker fantasy, and if you want a fantasy western, The Dark Tower is for you. You don't actually have to have read all of Stephen King to be able to read and appreciate The Dark Tower. That's not necessary at all. The Dark Tower is the story of Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger of a fallen kingdom, pursuing a man in black, a sorcerer whom he knows is responsible for the fall of his kingdom, and has a clue to the titular Dark Tower that is Roland's quest, that is the object of Roland's dreams and desires. The Dark Tower is almost an anti-fantasy in a lot of ways. It subverts a lot of the normal fantasy tropes. It takes a lot of the ideas that you're familiar with and spins them on their head. And it's not without its flaws, of course, but it is one of my personal favorite fantasy series. It's the one on this list that I've gone through and reread most recently. And I really cannot emphasize how important this series was to me at the stage of my life when I found it. It, weirdly enough, it gave me a lot of solace. I was going through a difficult transition, and the characters in this book were like friends to me. They were familiar at a time when nothing else was, and I can't put this series behind me. So, number 4 on my list, The Dark Tower. And you knew the big dog had to be on this list somewhere. Number 3, The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. No, I'm not putting Mistborn on this list. It does not crack the top 10, but Stormlight Archive absolutely 100% does. The Stormlight Archive is a worthy successor to The Wheel of Time in terms of being the kind of the archetypical huge multi-book fantasy. Brandon set out with a vision to give us a new kind of world and fully fleshed out, realized, developed characters that inhabit it and serve as our view into a world that is largely alien to us. And he succeeded. Some of my favorite characters of all time are in the Stormlight Archive. Kaladin, Yasna, Dalinar, Adolin, Shallan, Seth. These are all fantastic characters whom I adore and I'm rooting for, even as their struggles are going darker and darker and darker. And I have horrible predictions about Book 5. I really am afraid of where it's going to go, but we'll cover that in another video. Stormlight Archive, number 3. My hardback collection for my number 2 is somewhat limited, so for right now, this encyclopedia is going to have to serve as my stand-in for the entire Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time was my introduction to adult epic fantasy. I have gone through and reread those books more times than any other on my list. The Wheel of Time was eye-opening to me as a teenager, realizing what epic fantasy could be, how huge it really could get, that some of the normal tropes of classical fantasy could be tweaked slightly, and suddenly there's a whole new breath of life in them. Characters didn't have to operate on a code of morality that seemed intrinsic to their nature. Characters could be selfish and stupid, pig-headed, and still be really compelling. The Chosen One trope is kind of a fate worse than death, and having read this, as much as I do like Rand, and I don't like Rand, but I understand why Rand is as screwed up as he is. Jordan had a vision that, I'll admit, got out of hand. The slog is a real thing, but there's nothing else quite like the Wheel of Time. Even Stormlight Archive, which I think is a worthy successor to the Wheel of Time, doesn't quite have the same magic that these books do, and that's why they're number 2 on my list. And finally, guys, my number 1, the all-time fave rave, Discworld by Terry Pratchett. I think a lot of people who read serious fantasy overlook Discworld because they hear it's funny, and they assume it has no value to it, or they believe that it can't have value beyond the surface level. I've never found an author who can make me laugh and bring me to tears in the same page other than Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett writes the Discworld with a deep insight into human nature, a compelling understanding of who we are as people, our foibles, our hypocrisies, our intricacies, our moments of brilliance, and our moments of weakness. And he infuses that into all of his works. Discworld is an absurdist fantasy, but you're not ever laughing at the absurdity of it. Usually what you're laughing at is the things that are most true, the things that are most true about human nature, that are most true about our strengths and our weaknesses. No individual book in Discworld, with the exception of Thief of Time, no individual book is qualified as an epic fantasy. But when you take in the entire Discworld bibliography. Terry Pratchett is telling the story of a world that's waking up, a world that is in a transition, moving from an older classical fantasy setting into a world that is more modern, more industrialized, and much more familiar to our own. And he uses these stories to explore the struggles and the questions that we as a people and a society have to deal with in that setting. If you've never read Discworld, there are a lot of places to start. I personally recommend either Guards, the first in the City Watch series, or Going Postal, which is where I started and is the first of the Moist von Lipwig books. But really, a lot of them can serve as standalones. I picked up Night Watch because a lot of people regard it as the greatest of the Discworld books. I don't know if I personally agree with that. My vote probably goes to Small Gods, but that's just down to personal taste. But please give Discworld a try. I promise you, you will not regret it. And that's my list, guys. What did you think? Let me know if you think I royally screwed up, if you think there's anything else that should be on the list, or if you agree with my choices, and if you're curious about any of the books on here that you may not have read. I look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, bye-bye.